those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrea Sampson. Good afternoon and welcome to Sense Making Conversations. I'm going to be your host and guide today as we delve deeply into the issues that are impacting us all. You know, the work I get to do as a speaker's coach is really, really interesting. I work with deep subject matter experts and thought leaders who are addressing some of the most important challenges of our time. Everything from governance to technology, healthcare, equity and inclusion, climate change, and beyond. I get to have conversations with people who are doing the work to solve or address these challenges. These changes are happening on the changes that are happening on our planet today are exponential. And we've seen that in this past year with all of what's happened. I mean, look at how quickly we were able to go from understanding a virus to having some form of a vaccine in place. It's truly amazing. The climate change, in my opinion, is one of the most pressing issues we need to address. And the production and use of energy is one of the biggest culprits in climate change. Most of our energy still comes from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And yet, we have lots of access to clean energy. So why are we still reliant on fossil fuels? What about the companies that provide us with the energy we need? The grid that we use. It's expensive, sometimes not so reliable. Is this really the only way to solve the energy access question? What if there were other options? What if there were a different grid? What if we could create our own energy and be responsible for ourselves? These are the questions that are being asked and investigated in many different communities because access to the energy that we take for granted here in North America isn't so available in other places. As an example, in sub-Saharan Africa, roughly half the population, that's 600 million people, don't have access to electricity. Just imagine what your day would be like without access to electricity. None of us would have access to the devices that we use to stay connected to each other. We wouldn't be able to go and just cook up something to eat. And what would happen after the sun went down? No lights, no TV, no access to some of the conveniences that we just take for granted. So for many, energy is a luxury. And that's just not something we've really thought a lot about. So what is the answer? Well, I'm really excited for my conversation today with Arash Aazami, a purpose-driven entrepreneur and innovator who's half Persian, half Dutch, and was raised in West Africa. His initiatives merge energy, digital technology, and finance. He's a member at Singularity University of the Netherlands, which is where I first met him. And he's also a mentor of social entrepreneurship at INSEAD Business School in Paris and advises the European Commission and the Dutch government on long-term strategies for energy and digitization. He's also a Talk Boutique roster speaker. In 2010, Arash founded the world's first energy company that earns more as it sells less energy. And he recently founded universalright.org, a global energy exchange platform to support an internet of energy, which is aimed at democratizing access to clean, renewable energy. Welcome, Arash. I am so excited to start our conversation.
Thanks so much. And thanks for so much for having me and allowing me to share just a couple of ideas and some crazy things also with you guys today. And it's evening here in Rotterdam, and it's been a beautiful day also. Actually, I wanted to be on my bicycle today so much, but I was in the office getting prepared for all kinds of stuff that was happening, and here I am right now. So
One
let's
of the
hit
things I
it.
love about the Netherlands is all the people on bicycles. I remember almost getting run down by a whole group of them when I was there a couple of years ago when we were training together. I want to also welcome all of our guests today, and I want to remind our guests that you get to ask questions as well. feel free to drop your questions right into the chat and we'll make sure to address them. So I'm excited to get started. So let's just jump right in. So Arash, you're an expert in this field. Can you help us to understand why energy is the way it is today as a commodity? And why is this still in place? And why is, the question I asked as we set this up was, why is energy a product and not a right? So help us to understand. Let's just dig right into that question.
Yeah, okay. Um, we'll take a few hours to get through that. Uh, it's well, there's so much to share on this specific topic with you guys, and I'm gonna try and keep it short. But why is it a product and not a right? Because a product makes more money than a right. That's very shortly put. Has it always been a product? No, it hasn't. Has it always been a right? No, neither. The thing is that if we zoom out, we're going to look at energy through different eyes, put a different perspective on it. Um, one of the things that happened to me when I started to zoom out of this entire thing that we are in the middle of was that I realized that where we where we consider energy from fossil fuels as being the standard, that hasn't always been the case. We've only started using large quantities of fossil energy since the Industrial Revolution. In fact, it's the other way around. We could have the Industrial Revolution because we started to combust very highly concentrated forms of energy that we found in the crust of the earth. So prior to that, we were actually relying on primarily renewables. It's even through renewables that we set sail to discover new continents. So the fact that we are talking to one another and one is in Toronto and the other one is in Rotterdam in the Netherlands is because that some of our forefathers, through using renewables, have actually sailed all the way to North America. And and even if you look at the Netherlands, where I live, what are the Netherlands so known for? One of the things is the windmills, the old windmills. And it's in the 1600s, in the town that I was born in, there were 650 windmills. So that is fully 100% renewable powered energy supply. And that made that entire region extremely wealthy because they were building ships with the power of the wind. So it hasn't always been a commodity. It became a commodity because we started to extract large quantities of energy from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels were found in a place in the ground, and if it's a place, then it could be somebody's place, and so somebody would plant their flag on it, and it would be either a red flag or a green flag or a blue flag, and then if somebody put their flag on that place, then somebody else, of course, would have wanted to put their flag on that place. So it's been a source of conflict in many places in the world, and we still see that in the Middle East, and we see that in the in Sudan, and we see that in the South Chinese Sea, and we see that in Dakota, and we see that in many places. Energy is still a source of conflict as long as it comes from ownable resources. And in the meantime, we have used the industrialization to become a lot more smart, a lot more mobile. And one of the things that the fossil revolution brought us was that we suddenly could fulfill our energy needs at the flick of a switch. So fossil fuels have been a tremendous time saver for us humans. Because prior to that, yes, we relied on renewables, but it took us roughly half our waking hours to fulfill our primary needs. And the 600 million people that you were mentioning in sub-Saharan Africa are still doing that, collecting wood, for example, so that they can cook. And indeed, there's a huge divide energy-wise in the world because the people in Niger right now have access to roughly less than 1/100th of the amount of energy that the average Canadian does today.
Wow.
And still we expect the same things from them. You have to educate yourself, you have to do work, you have to contribute to society, contribute to economy, evolve with one another, do cool things, have a nice life, etc., etc. And it's just impossible if you have no access to a proper amount of energy. And um, now, what is revolutionizing society today? One of the big things is the shift that we are making slowly but surely to renewables again. But we're using the technologies that we have been able to develop over the past decades, thanks to the industrialization, thanks to using fossil fuels, to no longer have to need fossil fuels anymore and rely on renewables, but with new technologies, so that also these resources we can use at the flick of a switch. And now the huge difference is fossil fuels are scarce. You can fight over them. The sun, nobody can fight over the sun. The sun is owned by nobody. It will never bill anybody. So the only thing that we need to learn is how to harvest its abundance and serve all of us. So that's how I believe the energy will turn from a product into a right again within the next few decades.
Hmm. So I mean, really, a lot of that is dependent on renewables. And I
Mhm.
know when you and I were talking a couple of days ago, one of the things that we talked about was the fact that, we often look at energy as a consumable commodity. So there's the difference between consuming versus using. And I think that that's sort of an interesting, and especially as we start to move into the area of renewables,
Mhm.
because renewables have a completely different way of looking at them. So why don't we talk a little bit about that, the difference between consuming and using, and what the impact as we move into the renewable energy world, what does that look like?
Well, this is an amazing frame that I believe we haven't even started to discover yet. But there's such a fundamental difference between consuming and using, because once you've consumed something, it's gone and you cannot use it anymore. But if you use something and it's from a renewable resource, for example, you can use it again and again and again and again and again, and it's never going to be gone. And
Mm,
that's the huge difference between oil and coal and gas and sun and wind. You can use all the sun and wind that you can think of, but it's never going to be gone. There's always going to be sun. There's always going to be wind, and even if even in terms of geothermal energy, which is encapsulated within the earth, you can actually use that and reuse that, and probably for the next 2, 3, 4 billion years, there's going to be enough heat within the inside of the earth to serve all of nature.
so,
So consumption and using are fundamentally different things, and what I really believe is that once you move into a more circular economy, there's no longer going to be any consumption. We are not consumers. We should not teach our children to be consumers. We are, in fact, the only organism in nature that consumes stuff, because all the other organisms, they use things, and yes, they produce waste, but their waste will always be food to another organism. And now we are the ones that produce waste that is no food to other organism. And we take it out of the cycle of life and we throw it into the air, and we'll have to wait another millions of years before it's back there. So the rate at which we are consuming fossil fuels, for example, exceeds 1 million times the amount that the Earth can actually produce by turning plants and uh, organic material into oil, coal, and gas again. 1 million times. That's the speed difference. It's unbelievable. So that means that we have to cut down our fossil fuel consumption by at least a factor 1 million, which
wow.
means every investment in making fossil fuel consumption a bit more efficient is, well, to put it in French, it's bullshit. It doesn't work that way. The only thing that we should be investing is to design systems that rely on 100% renewables. There's no other option. And
Wow.
this is not even about the environment and climate and things like. It's just geological.
You know what? We've got an interesting question from one of our guests. Heather Christie Burns asks, to enable the democratization you mentioned, mining of minerals, battery storage is critical to supporting solar and wind. These are physical deposits with the same issue, conflict of ownership. It also has some consumption issues as well. What do you think about this?
Oh well, it's a wonderful question. So thank you, Heather. And it's wonderfully complex to try to answer. But the problem is the same. Yes, as long as we rely on technologies that rely themselves again on ownable materials, scarce materials, rare earth minerals, conflict materials, geopolitical uh, um, bonds between countries, then still we are extending the problem. So that means that yes, storage, I'm not even saying battery storage, but storage and buffering are critical to support whatever kind of renewables based energy system. But how do you buffer and how do you store and what materials do you use for that? There's a lot of amazing research and development going on in using locally available materials. There's great opportunity in converting forms of energy into other forms of energy prior to using them. And yes, you're taking a big loss of energy as you convert, for example, from power to heat or power to hydrogen or whatever kind of conversion you're thinking of. But if the source is abundant, then still you could do that with very little to no use of rare earth minerals or conflict materials. So I know that it's possible. I know that the site that this is going to be a trajectory of a couple of decades before this is really mainstream. But this really is something that we should pay a lot of attention to.
Yeah, it's something that I know we've talked a lot about, in the circles, certainly within Singularity University, and looking at battery technology, and as you said, storage, just storage in general, and how can we do that? And I see we've got a couple of our Singularity friends from Canada here on the call, and it's great because I know Jane, who I see. She and I have had a lot of conversations around what are some of the future usages. But I think when you talk about decreasing our reliance on fossil fuels by a million, by a factor of a million, certainly we're not at that same level with that, with the materials that we're using in storage, right? So we're not sort of approaching that same usage, although it still is an issue. So I think we have to solve it, and I know that there's a lot of really smart people out there right now doing that. But one of the things that I think you've done some, and I mentioned it in my opening remarks, around this idea of the Internet of Energy. And I love this concept, Arash, because I know it's something that is near and dear to your heart as well. But, when we look at the Internet in the way in which it is a decentralized network that allows us a democratization to some degree of information, I'm really, really curious to hear about how you're taking that concept, that idea, and starting to apply it in this world of energy, and especially in this world of renewables. So tell us a little bit about what that looks like and how that might help us in the future.
Oh, I'm so hoping for my slides that explain everything behind me right now. I'm going to try and do this in words. So we are actually we belong to a historic generation. We are the last generation that has ever experienced a world without internet, and the world has changed since its introduction. And the original idea, I'm a relatively old guy that was raised by an internet pioneer, so I still call myself kind of an ARPANET child rather than even an internet child. Um, but the original idea was that through being able through, for example, this www protocol, we've been able to interconnect by now 4.6 billion people, regardless of where they are, regardless of the device that they chose to purchase or use, regardless of the technology choices that they made, regardless so it's agnostic in that sense. It really interconnects anyone that is willing to be interconnected. And with that, you have this swarm of intelligence, of knowledge, of data, and of nonsense, and of videos of puppies and kittens that everybody can share amongst one another. And I love that of the internet. And of course, it's been used and abused in many, many ways. Look at, for example, the Facebooks and the Airbnbs and the Ubers of this world, which is based upon the technologies, distributed technologies of the internet, but using a very highly centralized business model, for example. So, um, for me, that's still the old economy. And the new economy is really about distribution. And distribution comes when all the users are allowed to do everything that the system requires themselves. And with energy, that means I believe that energy, just like in nature, travels peer to peer. In nature, it never comes from a centralized source other than the sun, but once it's in the earth, energy, nutrients, water, whatever nature needs in order to be nature flows in all kinds of directions. And even if you look at a forest and you're going to analyze the forest, it's actually, there's this entire mycelial network that is integrating all the organisms in this forest. And I believe that the same will happen to our energy system. So that means that you don't think in terms of a centralized power unit anymore, for example, but everything can be done by any peer on the net. Now, what is anything? You can use energy, you can produce, convert energy, you can store energy, you can be a provider of balance, you can be a provider of information, you can be a provider of any kind of smartness, and then the entire grid is basically gonna behave itself like a flock of birds. So, if you're looking, for example, at a flock of sparrows, and there's 20,000 sparrows, and it really looks magical. Who is the lead sparrow? There is none. Who's the boss? Who holds the intelligence? There is none. Which sat-nav system are they following with one another? You cannot point your finger at it. There's a very simple algorithm that consists of only something like 5 or 6 rules that all these sparrows abide by, and therewith they move into these beautiful shapes and forms and into the direction that they need to go. And they're very simple to explain. For example, you more or less follow the direction of the sparrow in front of you. You keep a certain distance from your fellow birds that are around you. If you're at the outside of the flock, then you're trying to move your way into the inside of the flock because that's where you're more safe. You have to, so there's just a couple of rules, and we're designing energy systems today that abide by these same kinds of rules, where anyone can actually play whatever role is required in the system, and it's always automatically balance seeking. Now, this is fundamentally different from the market mechanisms that we know today. So in the current market, any market, the value of a product is defined by the difference between supply and demand at any given moment. Mm-hmm. So if there is a shortage of face masks, then suddenly the price of face masks is going to increase by a factor.
And that comes back to the commodity question, right, that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. Yeah. So with energy, same thing happens. Energy companies can exist as long as there is a deficit between supply and demand at any given moment, because that defines the price of their energy. In our systems, these systems are naturally balance seeking. So that means that the highest point of value in the system is no longer the difference between supply and demand, but the point of balance between supply and demand.
Mm-hmm. So if I'm a heavy user and I'm throwing the balance off, what happens? Am I paying for it? Is this system, is there a cost to it? Tell me a little bit about that.
There's definitely a cost to it, but you're no longer connected to the system because you're depending from it. You're connected to the system because you have value to it. And whatever thing you're doing is of value to the system, because if there's a surplus of supply into the system and there's no demand, then it's off balance. So there needs to be demand at that moment. And if there's a lot of supply and there's some demand, then somebody needs to do something with the surplus. For example, providing the power to convert this energy into a heat buffer that you can use in the winter, for example. So everybody has a role to play, and this is it's all fluid, and it's all interconnected. So what we're doing right now is researching new market models, and this is closely watched by, for example, the Dutch government, because they're looking at new models of design, of market design. And if you do that with balance as your design principle, then suddenly you're going to notice that you don't pay for an amount of energy anymore. You don't pay for the volume anymore. You pay to be connected, but you're also
Right.
valuable to the system, which means that if through your connection you're adding balance to the system by doing whatever you need to do at that certain moment, then you're going to get paid for that. If you are disrupting the system because you're requiring a tremendous amount of energy while it's not there, you're going to pay for it. If you're connected to the system and you're throwing a lot of energy on the system while there's no demand, you're going to pay for that. So
Right.
it's a lot more natural in that way.
So let me get this straight, because I want to make sure that, that I understand it, is that basically I would connect to this system. It's a grid system, but it's an independent grid system, a peer-to-peer. And I'm connected to it, and I have a couple of different options. One, I can upload energy to the system through my own power generation. That could be through solar, through wind, through hydro, whatever way that I can generate power. But I'm also going to use it. And what it's always looking for is a balance of what I'm giving to the system from what I'm taking from the system. And if there's a balance in that, then my costs are much lower, because really it's just about access as opposed to use. But if I'm using more than I'm giving, then there's a cost of access. If I'm giving more than I'm using, then maybe I get paid. Is that the case? Or I get some sort of a credit back for it?
If you're giving more than you're using and there is a need on the other hand, on the other end, then yeah, that's going to be beneficial to you.
Yeah.
If you're giving more than you're using, but there's no demand for that, then
Right.
still you're disrupting the system.
Right.
You're going to be paying for that. So it's kind of a mind shift. Yeah.
Now, is also, like, when we talk about the internet is widely accessible around the world. It's a peer-to-peer network, and it has circled the globe, as you said. Over, what was it, 4 billion people are on it today. Are you imagining a grid of energy grid that would be the same? I mean, right now we're very, very reliant upon our local energy companies, right? And so, here in Toronto, we're using Toronto Hydro. Would I no longer be, connected into Toronto Hydro? I would be in the Internet of Energy and in this worldwide grid. Is that what it looks like?
Yes, in a way it does, but also, and this is some really, I found it funny research that was done in the early days of the internet. The designers and pioneers were expecting that most of the data traffic would occur between peers that were far apart. And then they found out that something like 90% of all data traffic was actually on local area networks, which required different choices to be made in terms of storage and things like that. And I believe that the exact same thing is going to happen with the energy networks, because I believe that we can rely on most of the cases on locally produced energy, locally stored energy, locally converted energy. So that means that still you're going to be connected to your local peers, the other people in your neighborhood, the businesses in your neighborhood. And but you can regard it as cells that are, I would say, for 80-90% of the time self-subsisting, and for their deficits they're going to rely on the connection to neighboring cells. So yes, the entire world is going to be interconnected, but it's not going to happen. It's not very likely that energy is going to travel from Australia to Canada to fulfill your needs, because chances are that you're going to find the fulfillment of that need very much more close to you. And so it's a lot more local, actually. It's by globalizing an idea, actually localize energy communities. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually one of our guests, so Leonard Lilau, I hope I said that correctly, wanted to know, how do you start this new model of balance in a market where imbalance is the business model?
That's a very, very difficult question. And Leonard, well, we do talk every now and then, and I don't have the answer still, but this is in fact this is really what needs to be researched right now, and we are doing research on this. But it really requires, for example, different ways of pricing access to energy systems, different ways of taxating energy, because in Europe we're very accustomed to paying energy taxes over the volume that we are using. And the volume doesn't matter anymore in these models because it can come from anywhere. Um, and if you start from the paradigm of abundance, then why would you tax volume? So, if it's like you would be taxed for the amount of breaths that you take per day. It just doesn't make sense.
Mm.
So yes, imbalance in the current market is the business model. But one of the things that we found out by now already is that if you create local energy communities that are interconnected and fulfilling one another's needs on a local scale, then their interconnection to neighboring communities needs to be a lot less thick, a lot less dense or wide. So you need a lot less bandwidth to be interconnected to others because you're going to be self-sufficient in so many more ways. And because of that alone, the entire system is going to be a lot cheaper for all of you.
But it sounds like it still will be networked globally. Like you may use locally, but it's networked globally. And you would have, I would assume, some local storage facilities so that, again, you've got easy, I mean, similar to the internet where, we have all of these routers and towers and things that still, I mean, in a global world, we still have local connections and we need to. I mean, these things are important.
Yes, and even in the case of, because you were mentioning routers, what I like about this in the Internet of Energy is you're no longer going to rely on an energy meter, but your energy meter is actually going to be an energy router because it's constantly going to optimize the routing of energy, of streams of energy. Do they have to come out of your house and go into into your community, or do they have to come from your community and go into your house? Is it more is it required to have that in the form of electricity, or is it going to be some form of gas or hydrogen or whatever? Is it going to be heat? Could be anything, and it just depends on the moment. It depends on the form of the need, and so we have to learn to continuously optimize the routing of energy. So the energy router, that's going to be a big business in the future.
Arash, this has been absolutely fascinating. We've gone a little bit over, so I know it goes fast, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Goes really fast. So I want to thank you for all of what you have helped us to start to see. And I'm going to reserve the right that maybe you'll come back and talk to us again, because I think we've just barely scratched the surface today on this. And yeah.
And it's an honor and a pleasure. And I see one more beautiful question from Karen. How can we give our teenage children hope? How can we empower them? That's a big one because yes, that's exactly what we need to do. And one of the things is this app. So earlier today, I was allowed to do a session and I closed with, we have to educate ourselves and our children to no longer be consumers and behave like consumers because we are so much more than that. If we can educate ourselves to no longer be consumers, we know that we are always worthy. We're always worth something. And that already says so much about how we are interconnected and how we are valuable to the system, rather than being the end station, the bottom of the food chain, because that's what the consumer is in a market. So I believe that we have to deconsumerize ourselves.
Right. And we show them that they have the power to actually create, not just consume. And what an empowering message. What an empowering message. Well, thank you so much, Arash. And I know I can see, Karen he wants more, or she wants more depth into it. And we just don't have time to go into it, but we will. I think we'll come back and we'll keep this going. So thank you so much for joining us. Join me next week, or actually join me on June 8th for our next sense-making conversation, where we will talk with Tim Coldwell about his Indigenous roots and his journey to becoming the CEO of one of the largest construction companies in Canada, who are a B Corp and focused on doing good in the world. So join us then. I can't wait to see you. In the meantime, I want you all to think about the ways in which you are consuming energy, the ways in which you're using energy, and how you can do it a little differently. Arash, it has been fantastic. Thank you. Thank you to all of our guests for coming and joining us. And I look forward to seeing you on June 8th for our next sense making conversations.
Thanks so much.